In the past, I have criticized fascism, and by that I mean the actual doctrine of Italian fascism. I'm not using that term inclusively. My critique is similar to Julius Evola's, and the basic problem with it is that it reduces what is in reality a variegated population of people down to a homogeneous mass. There's a sense in which the error that fascism makes is the same error that postmodernism makes, in which it envisages unity in a too literal way, causing it to create something that is more so a singularity than a unity. So of course the main symbol of fascism is the fasces, which is a bundle of sticks around an axe. It symbolizes strength through unity, but the way fascism conceives of unity is essentially non-difference or conformity. This is actually a false unity. A true unity respects the diversity of human persons, and as Evola states, it more so resembles movement of heterogeneous elements around a stable center. The homogeneity of fascism isn't so much the opposite of the postmodern so-called diversity, but rather it's actually a replication of its end result. Everyone gets condensed down into undifferentiated gray goo. Now, I know that the left often equivocates right-wing ideologies unfairly. They call all conservatives fascists to such an extent that the term fascist ceases to have any real meaning. They also like to go back in time and retroactively call ideologies and regimes that existed before the invention of fascism, which doesn't make any sense at all. I actually tried to get a leftoid to explain to me how this thought process makes sense, and he couldn't give me an answer. Regardless, there's one sense in which I think the criticism that conservatives are fascists is actually somewhat accurate, and that is in the sense that both desire a high degree of social conformity enforced by the state. The reason I bring this up is because both conservatives and fascists have a tendency to want to quash all deviance from the norm. They look at homosexuality, promiscuity, addiction to porn, tobacco, or drugs as a deviation away from what ought to secure the common good. They think a homogeneous unity is the only way to maintain stability in society, so they go about destroying any kind of deviation or difference. But really, I think this is ultimately not a real unity, as I've already said, but also I don't think it's productive for a very simple reason. People who are deviants are not just temporarily embarrassed normies, but rather they're a completely different type of person. There is something in their biological constitution that differs from other people. In the case of homosexuals, it's a combination of environmental factors with different genes that are associated with same-sex sexual behavior. People who are promiscuous have different personalities from other people. Some of them might even have borderline personality disorder, which, like all mental disorders, is heritable. Some people are just born with an instinct to seek extreme sensations or to push boundaries, and nothing can deter them from this. The task of deterring or punishing deviance really doesn't convince these people to become normal, and it might actually entice them toward rebelliousness and open defiance of the regime. This is essentially why I think the proposition that right-wing society must destroy all degeneracy, deviance, and nonconformity is moribund. You can never actually eradicate it, only drive it underground. And when you put the backs of degens against the wall, they end up becoming your enemies. Whereas if they were integrated into society instead of being excluded from it, they might still support the regime. What we see is the externalities of rampant degeneracy, such as the Pride movement, the LGBT ideology, gender ideology, and so on, are not organic outgrowths of deviancy. Instead, they are actually concerted political movements funded and driven by power actors. Assuming that in a right-wing society, these power actors would not be in a position to agitate deviance, and also assuming that society made an attempt to accommodate deviancy in some way, I don't think you would have a problem. Most kinds of deviancy do not pose a threat to the social order. Take homosexuality, for instance. Homosexuality only concerns a very small number of men, and homosexuality tends to be very inflexible, for men at least. The vast majority of homosexuals statistically are and will be homosexuals for their entire lives. The actual number of homosexuals in the population is negligible, only around 1 to 5% at most. Nothing about homosexuality requires us to redefine genders or become skeptical of biology or science. The existence of homosexuality does not in any way inhibit a traditional society from functioning and perpetuating. Ancient Greece and Rome were full of homosexuals, and it never caused people to shrink away from their duties or abandon their faiths. Likewise, pockets of the population being promiscuous, or the existence of prostitution or brothels, even pornography, does not pose any threat to the social order. Greece was full of brothels, Rome had brothels, And as I've said countless times, even during the golden age of European traditional society, the Middle Ages, there were loads of brothels and lots of premarital sex. This did not cause Europe to self-implode. It never caused a backslide into gender skepticism or transgenderism. I might even go as far as Guillaume Maffei does in his book Sex and Deviance, and argue that brothels actually serve an important function in society because they allow promiscuous people to meet their needs without interfering with the sanctity and integrity of other people's families. The basic logic is that promiscuous people will be promiscuous no matter what you do, so if you don't provide an outlet for them, they'll just engage in adultery, which is far worse than them just being promiscuous and going to a brothel. Because the alternative to this is to have promiscuous people get married and have families, and that's obviously not going to turn out well because they will cheat on their spouse and it will implode the family. I've also made a video where I criticized the anti-porn movement, showing that porn is not actually harmful to the people who use it. The most surprising takeaway from the research I did was that people who used more porn reported better relationship satisfaction than people who only occasionally used it. So evidently, something like porn addiction, which questionably even exists, does not hurt society. The presence of porn does not impede traditional society from functioning. One needs only to consider that pornographic vases existed in Greece to understand that tradition and sexuality are not diametrically opposed. The actual task of the right isn't to constrict around segments of its own people's society that it doesn't like and then try to eradicate them as if they were diseases, but rather its real task is to find a way to integrate every diverse type of person into its social order harmoniously. Targeting specific persons as undesirable creates discord rather than unity. It sets brother against brother needlessly. It creates social paranoias like the kind that predominated in the era of the bourgeoisie, where bourgeois morality was at its height, prompting people to create manners societies and deeply regulate social behavior until it became a stiff complex of conformity. In the worst case, it ends up creating pointless classism, where the poor are considered degenerates and a source of evil and disease, while the rich get to enjoy as much deviance as they wish, as long as they keep it private. The mass medicalization of society was in part driven by this notion that poverty and deviance went hand in hand. As Foucault wrote, England launched various welfare programs that aimed to provide medical treatment for the poor based on the assumption that sickness and vice originated from the poor and then spread to the rest of the population. As men of the right, we do not have to accept the stereotypified conception of what traditionalism means. Much of what passes for traditionality is a bourgeois anachronism. My position is the same as Julius Evola's, that traditional society does not have to be sex negative, nor do we have to treat every deviation from the norm as inherently negative. Traditional society does not have to be fascistic in the pejorative sense. In other words, we don't have to repeat the errors of fascism. It's possible, and perhaps even easier, to promote traditional values when all of our people are included in the project. If tradition cannot survive deviance, then it has proven to be without strength. But history has proven that tradition can survive, even thrive, despite the existence of deviance. And what this means for you is basically that we will not throw out great artists and creatives simply because they are deviant. It's almost cliche to point out that artists tend to be very bohemian and Dionysian. Chances are that your favorite music artist is promiscuous, or does drugs, or is an alcoholic. Tons of cultural touchstones like The Matrix were made by deviants. The Wachowski brothers trooned out, as everyone knows. And despite that, how many of you still call things red-pilled and blue-pilled? The contrary attitude to mine, which is shared by rightoids and bourgeois conservatives, is to punish every instance of deviance, to cut all deviance out of society, ensure they can have no prosperity or influence, to ensure that they cannot coexist in the social order. The consequence of this is that society gets really, really boring. How many of you haven't done some binge drinking before? How many of you have managed to avoid having premarital sex? How many of you are perfect little productive bourgeois angels? I would wager that almost none of you are. We all have vices, and some of us are deviants in some way. The fact of the matter is that modern life is pure suffering, and a lot of us seek an outlet in the form of extreme sensations and various kinds of distractions. It's not ideal, but it brings people some measure of joy in a largely joyless world. To take that away from people, to tell them they can't have vice, to tell them that they must be perfectly disciplined machines built for nothing other than production and procreation, is to rob us of some part of our humanity. is to render life banal and senseless, to subject us to the torture of endless monotony. It's not just deviance that this bourgeois attitude targets, but also perfectly innocent examples of indulgence. We are told that we should avoid all fried food, we shouldn't drink soda, we shouldn't sit down, we shouldn't smoke. We're told that we should never drink, that we should never play video games because it's a waste of time. And working a dead-end job isn't a waste of time. It's a waste of my time for another person's benefit. We should ultimately have a right to waste time. We should have a right to have fun. We should have a right to be imperfect. That's what I'm arguing here. Any society that expects us to be sinless is a society that does not factor the full consequences of a fall into account. In the Middle Ages, the clergy never expected the laity to be perfect. So why do bourgeois Christians in the modern world, a world which is full of opportunities to sin, expect the average person to be able to go their whole lives without sinning once, without deviating from the norm even once? It's a completely unrealistic expectation. I've seen all kinds of proposals. Some rightoids want to make masturbation illegal. Some want to make premarital sex illegal. It's almost unanimous among rightoids that we should make prostitution illegal. But how many people can actually genuinely benefit from these restrictions? How can you possibly abide by them perfectly if you're an imperfect man with original sin? There's a point at which these laws become righteous yet imprudent. We would have to jail half of the country because only saints could be perfectly and utterly chaste. And this paranoia over sex and deviance has even led to some members of the right essentially saying that sex is horrible, sex is evil, that no one should ever reproduce. Nick Fuentes has said having sex with women is gay. He's at various times said that not being married is gay, having a family is gay. He has said all kinds of absolutely ridiculous stuff about this, simply off of the back of this conservative skepticism or fear of sex. We're so used to the left going after people's creative expression and censoring people's words and impugning people's deeds, but we all forget that the right does this all the time as well. In the 1990s, Jack Thompson went on a crusade to get the government to ban violent video games based on the spurious notion that they create violent people. There was, of course, the Satanic Panic and the attempt to get D&D banned or to get people to avoid playing D&D. There's similar arguments from conservatives about porn. I've heard claims that porn creates rapists. This isn't true, by the way. There's no data that proves this, and plenty of countervailing evidence. For example, as porn becomes available in different countries, rates of rape start going down. It's the same story as violent video games. Rightoids tell us about this deviant thing and how it's a serious epidemic of vice and evil. Then the data shows that it isn't, but the rightoids are intransigent. They insist that everything that isn't church or work be banned. But at least the rightoids get the momentary levity of the fact that now leftists are increasingly opposed to porn as well, since they believe it objectifies women and creates misogynists. All the while, amidst this hyper-political maelstrom, the very thing under attack is the right to have fun, the right to have joy. I feel like I'm alone in saying this, but I don't want society to turn into work, taxes, church, and football. The 1950s was a parody of tradition. Greeks, Romans, and Catholics all love wine. The only people who hate wine are modern so-called traditionalists who think the morality of the bourgeois 19th century is traditional. You know what people also thought in the 19th century? That blowing smoke up your ass cures leprosy. Not everything invented in the past is good, and not everything invented before today is traditional. It's time to stop believing in stereotypes that have been prefabricated for us. We can be right-wing and also be pro-fun. The most right-wing man in the world, Julius Evola, also liked binge drinking, smoking, sex, and jazz. To a conservative of the time, to say you like jazz is today like saying you enjoy listening to UK drill to your grandpa. You would have gotten plenty of funny looks from the bourgeois conservatives of that era simply for enjoying jazz. In the end, the proper attitude should be like this. I am right-wing, but I'm not a conservative. I'm a traditionalist, but I'm not a conservative. Conservatism can end along with the era of the dominance of the bourgeoisie.